until the end of the winter. This pergola is going to look a real picture. But I suppose the most extravagant display of the year comes from this laburnum. Now, if you want to do this sort of thing, either over a pergola or an arch, then you really need to go to a nursery rather than a garden centre and buy one-year-old trees, whips they call them, and then they'll be supple enough to be able to bend over the top of the pergola so that the blooms hang down in the middle. They'll need to be pruned hard later on in the summer, but I'll come back to that in August. The wisteria are getting away well now, and this one is about 3 years old. If you want it to flower this early in its life, remember that you need to ask for a grafted plant rather than a seedling. Most of them are grafted these days, but it's well worth asking. Well, later in the programme, Anne Swithenbank visits a prize-winning pond and bog garden. But if you feel you haven't got space for that sort of thing, well, I've got some ideas for you too. And I've also got some alternative ideas on planting containers. But first of all, just have a look at this plant. The purple mullein is, I think, a delightful plant, producing these lovely long spikes of flowers. And it really does aim to please. Now, many of the verbascums are biennials, but this one is a true perennial. But it is short-lived, but that doesn't actually matter because it'll seed itself all over the place, producing a variety of colours in these pinks and purples and just occasionally whites as well. Now, if you do get a really good colour and you want to keep that, then you'd have to propagate that vegetatively, and that's done by root cuttings in the autumn. If you cut the spikes back, then it's quite likely that you'll get another display of flowers later in the year. But then, of course, you lose the seeds. And personally, I prefer to let them seed all over the place in these lovely colours. Well, who would have thought this? My potatoes caught by frost in early June. I think they'll recover, but it'll certainly set them back a bit. Fortunately, I've had some covered with spun polypropylene material, and they're fine. Now, there's a lesson for next year. And I'm learning a lesson from this little trial too. Do we really need to dig? Now, on this side is a deep bed, deeply dug and manured and growing a range of vegetables. But on this side, the same vegetables, but I haven't dug this bed for 2 years. Instead, I'm using compost and supplementing that with some spent mushroom compost, which I've had stacked up for a year, and it's produced some beautiful stuff. And the vegetables on this side seem to be growing even better than the ones in the deep beds. If you have no room for vegetables at all, then you can always grow them in containers. Instead of strawberries in this strawberry pot, I've got tomatoes in the top in amongst the flowers, and some of the more attractive varieties of herbs too. And bear in mind that these are just as good in the kitchen as the ordinary varieties. And it's much the same sort of thing in this container. You can just see a bit of parsley poking out there amongst the flowers, and again the tomato. Now, this is the new variety tumbler, and it's absolutely ideal for containers, and you can grow them in hanging baskets too. This container is actually fiberglass, but I think it's a very good lead look-alike, and of course a fraction of the price. I like to use in my containers and baskets a soil-based compost because it gives you just that little buffer in case you forget to water. So a John Innes compost is ideal. I've absolutely crammed this one full of vegetables. I've got courgettes in here and French beans. I've even sown some radish. And the whole thing will be dominated by this upright growing variety of tomato. That's Gemini. But of course this one will need tying in as it grows.
This is a new hardy osteospermum called Stardust, and I rather like it. I found it for sale in this garden centre, and of course today garden centres are big business. They are, after all, the places where most people come and buy their plants. And because of that, the varieties that are offered in large retail outlets like this tend to be the ones that turn up in most people's gardens. So who chooses them? Who decides that this is the variety that you and I should buy? Well, people like Mike Dunnett, who's the managing director of Blakedown Nurseries in Worcestershire, one of the largest wholesale raisers of trees, shrubs and other hardy plants in the country. They don't sell directly to you and to me, but these are the people who actually supply the garden centres. In Mike's case, with about 2.5 million plants a year, in something around 1,500 different varieties.
As a modern-day plant collector interested in plants and introducing new plants, one of the things one has to do is to scour the world and try and find these different variants. I mean, I've been fortunate in my sort of recent years in my career to have been to Australia, New Zealand, America on several occasions, most of Europe, South Africa, and just recently I've just come back from Albania on a plant collecting trip. But don't get us wrong, we're not scouring the world and ripping plants out of the natural habitats. What we're really looking for are plants possibly which are native plants, but there may be variations on them. An example of that is a plant called scabious butterfly blue, which is a native British plant, a variety of Scabiosa columbaria, the native European scabious, which is more compact, much longer flowering than the native species. Genista Vancouver Gold, a plant from Canada, is a selection of Genista pilosa.
Now let's suppose you found the new plant, you think it looks promising. How do you then evaluate it before you take it any further?
Well, we have to be certain that any new plant is going to be suitable for the gardens of the 1990s. Like everything else, gardens and gardeners are changing. The gardener of the 1990s wants to spend more time in his garden as a leisure area rather than digging, say, for vegetables or whatever. So the plant must fit into that situation. In other words, it must be easy to look after with as little of pruning as possible. Gardens, of course, have got progressively smaller over the last 20-odd years. So plants which are compact, which are very floriferous, which really earn their keep within the garden are very, very important. What I think we try and do is to test our plants to destruction. Now, people don't think you test plants to destruction. By that I mean we try and make sure we try as many hostile soil types as possible. We expose plants to as many hard winters as we possibly can. Part of our trials will include different propagation techniques to find what is the optimum time to propagate any new plant. Bear in mind, of course, that often these plants haven't been propagated commercially before. So we will take different types of cuttings, different lengths of cuttings at different times of the year. Ornamental horticulture, the production of hardy plants, is still very labour intensive and a very skilled job. And the propagator, of course, is the start of the whole exercise. If he can't get his part right, then we've got no plants to grow on.
What happens to them next?
From the small pot, which we call the liner pot, the small pot, they're then moved on into a much bigger pot. Now, what pot size depends on the type of plant it is, the sort of growth it will make, and the sort of plant which is acceptable to be sold during the garden centre. So they're potted on in a semi-mechanical means through a potting machine into these larger pots. We use a lot of peat, clearly, and we are very aware of the necessity to attempt to save what is not an infinite material. Therefore, we are now trying to use diluters to reduce the amount of peat content in the compost. We use a product on this nursery called Rockwool, about 15% of the volume. Some people would like us to abandon peat-based compost overnight. This is really not possible. We have spent over 40 years experimenting and using research to perfect these very sophisticated composts that we're using today. The complete peat substitute compost will come, but it won't be for many years.
Presumably the cost of a plant in a garden centre is influenced largely by the expense of the trialling.
Well, trialling is certainly expensive, but only one element of it. When we come to launch a plant onto the commercial plant market, that is also extremely expensive. Each variety will cost in excess of £20,000.
Oh yes, this is the osteospermum that I saw earlier. Where did this one come from, Mike?
Well, this is a beautiful plant, Stefan, and one that's come from a chance find. This was found by a lady in North Yorkshire called Pat Perry, and she found it in her garden, and she brought it to us just to see if we felt it had any commercial value. And early on in our trials, we recognised that this particular plant, as an osteospermum, was much more compact. It had these lovely long flower stems, beautiful, obviously pink flower with a yellow eye. And also, having been raised in North Yorkshire, clearly it was going to be very hardy in comparison with the other African daisies. We took it on board after our trials. We started bulking it up, and this year we should be supplying garden centres with something in the order of 150,000 plants.
Over the years, Mike Dunnett's built up a fair collection of promising new plants. But like any other commercial enterprise, plant raising is a highly competitive business, and so the very best plants are surrounded by a cloak of high security. Yes, the opposition certainly won't find it easy to sneak in here and take any cuttings. I've been sworn to secrecy, but they've just allowed me a peep inside the top secret polythene tunnel. I'm not really supposed to mention any of these plants by name, but I'm going to put my money on a lovely new dwarf penstemon, which will have to wait about 3 years before it turns up in your garden centre.
What you do in your back garden is your own affair, especially if you've got privacy. But with a front garden, it's different, because there you're under public scrutiny, especially if you're on a busy street. And yet, surprisingly, few people really develop their front gardens to full potential. But a man with plenty of ideas is Adrian Bloom, and he took me along to see 2 inspirational front gardens at Roydon in Norfolk. So, Adrian, what was the idea behind this?
Well, it was really that I've always felt people could do much more with their front garden. I mean, for instance, if you look at the average estate, most of the garden's pretty boring, if in fact you could say the front garden is a garden. After all, you know, what is a front garden used for? Most people perhaps have a lawn and a few plants around it, a few bulbs, a few roses. And in fact, nobody sits out on that lawn. Nobody actually goes out and sits there and has a cup of tea and sees what the neighbours are doing. And so, you know, what is the purpose of it, and why not, in fact, change it over more or less completely to plants? And so, in order to show what could be done in a small garden, I actually went along one October night 18 months ago and knocked on the door of Mr. and Mrs. Putt. And I asked them if they'd like to have a garden, not only, of course, free of charge, but to be planted up in one day. And the idea of that particular garden was really to have colour all the year round, but also to have winter interest, and therefore I would have to select plants which would be in scale with the whole of the house. It would include shrubs and conifers, and also, of course, alpines and bulbs and so on. And that was planted up and has been actually quite successful. Well, next door neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I heard, were interested in a garden, and the next door front garden, I thought, well, we'll do something completely different. So a few weeks ago, we came up here and we actually planted another garden in a day.
What's a lot of gravel?
Yes, it is a lot of gravel, and of course there's a purpose in that, because it's a drought-resistant garden, and even though it's raining today, and obviously even the drought garden is certainly glad to see the rain, I've used the gravel for 2 or 3 purposes. Firstly, it's very attractive visually, particularly with the type of plants that I've used, and secondly, it's a good mulch. It keeps in the moisture, and thirdly, it's also a good mulch because it keeps down the annual weeds.
Using those different sizes of stone makes it interesting, and I love the way you've got those sempervivums just sort of naturally planted down in that big flint. That really does look natural.
Yes, well, I think when you have a rather flat lawn, as this was, you really want to try to give a little bit of scale, even if it's very small scale. So I've tried to sort of do what is a dry riverbed, which seems topical as well, and getting a view from in front, the Johnson's front window, round through the garden to the road, and also a nice vista from this point going backwards. And it's all local stone. There's a small pea shingle, and then we've used some larger stones to sort of delineate the edge of that stream. And then the larger flints I've placed around in order to give it a little bit more interest and structure.
Well, you've got plenty of colour here now, but then it's midsummer, so there should be. What have you got laid on for winter interest?
Well, I think some of the grasses and, in fact, sedges provide that for a start. You've got that sort of year-round effect. They do change in colour, but those are effective, and they move a bit in the wind to give you that movement. But you've got the conifers. We've got an Elaeagnus there, which is an evergreen and goes a good golden colour. And then there's a pine here, which is going to cover up, to some extent, the edge of that hard wall. Pinus sembra glauca, the mountain pine. and then one or two other pines and shrubs, which can be kept down to the right sort of scale.
You've got a Virginia, which is really
yes,
nice.
well that one is Bressingham Ruby, which is just coming green in the summer, but that goes a lovely purple, and that's next to a grass called a chorus ogan, and that one's a bright yellow. And then you've got plants, of course, like the black-leaved Ophiopogon, almost forgot the name myself there, which always looks good in the winter-time. So there is quite a lot with the Hebes as well, quite a lot of interest at that time of year too.
Well, this garden's very young and got a long way to go, but the Putts next door, that's been down 18 months. That's really coming on now, isn't it? But what happens next? What about maintenance?
Well, this is a year-round garden, Nigel, and it was planted with a view to putting in shrubs and conifers which would provide year-round colour as well as perennials. But those things have to be kept in scale, and some of the shrubs like the cornus, the dogwoods, which we have those different coloured stems, have to be pruned back each year. Some of the conifers that are getting quite large also need pruning back, and even some of the spreading plants need keeping under check.
Yes, because you've got a lot of plants in a pretty small space, haven't you?
Well, in fact, altogether, I mean, it's again a plants garden, and there's probably 50 or 60 different types of plants in this area, which is only 20 feet by 20 feet again. But beyond that, we've actually just done some mulching, because last year we did actually suffer in the drought, and one or two plants were lost. So there's been a mulch of bark just put on.
Well, this is a tiny little lawn, Adrian. Are you sure it's not too small to be worth bothering with?
I think that it does have a purpose. Firstly, yes, we could have done without the lawn in one way, but the owners actually wanted the lawn. They didn't want it all dug up. And secondly, because of the design and the different types of garden that we have, it does serve a nice barrier between the two. And, of course, on the right-hand side here, we've got the herbaceous and perennials and the shrubs, and those, of course, mulched with bark. And on the left, the alpine garden, and of course that's got shingle, and it's a different scale again. And the smaller scale wants a smaller outlook. And I think the lawn comes in very handy there.
What are you going to do next on the alpine garden?
Well, there's not very much to do. Obviously, we keep down the weeds, but there are one or two gaps I'd actually like to fill with one or two attractive alpines. A bit too much space between one or two of them, and then I'm going to mulch over as well then after that with some shingle, because there's a few bare patches.
Well, you've certainly set a fine example here, and looking around the estate, there's plenty of scope for development there. Do you think you've started a trend?
Well, I hope so, Nigel, but I think most of all I do hope that it will at least encourage people to think of what they could do with their own front garden.
Ponds are a great source of fascination and make popular garden features, particularly wildlife ponds, as more people begin to realise how important their gardens are as habitats. This pond has won the garden category of the National Pond Competition organised by the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. It was designed and built by Jill Turner and her family, and in fact their whole garden is a haven for wildlife, including nesting boxes for birds.
I've always been interested in wildlife gardening. Back in 1983, we watched a programme on wildlife gardening, which really inspired me to build an actual pond. It was actually 1989 before we put the pond in, because my younger son was old enough then to be safe around the pond.
And are you pleased with the amount of wildlife you've got in here?
Oh yes, more than pleased, yes. In the 2 years it is, quite incredible. We've got lots of frogs, frog spawn, diving beetles, water boatmen, pond snails.
And how did you go about constructing it?
Well, it was fairly straightforward. We dug a hole down to about 3 foot deep, which will stop the pond freezing over in the winter, with sloping sides, which we then lined with a strong butyl liner. Obviously it needs to be very strong, which we then covered with a 6-inch layer of soil, and we actually planted the plants into the soil so that it would look as natural as possible. We also incorporated a marshy area for the plants that like to be in damp soil but not actually in the water.
And I also like the way your grass comes right up to the edge.
Yes, yes. That does make the pond look natural, which is the idea. And it is planted up with native wild plants. We've got water mint, water forget-me-nots, brookline, marsh marigolds earlier in the spring, irises. Yes, quite a selection.
And some bog plants as well?
Yes, in the marshy area we've got ragged robin and a primula, which isn't actually native.
No, neither is the mimulus,
That's
but it's
right,
been around
yes.
for quite a while,
Yes,
hasn't it? Yes. And I notice you've got quite a large water lily.
Yes, too big really for a pond of this size. We do have to cut that back every spring as well to keep it within bounds.
With all this profusion of growth, you must have to do quite a lot of maintenance.
Yes, we do. Every spring we do need to pull out the surplus. We put a ladder across the pond. We don't go in the pond because of damaging the liner. So we put a ladder across and I send my husband Gary over to pull out this surplus, mainly oxygenating plants, which we then leave on the side of the pond so that the insects can just crawl back into the water.
What do you do with the surplus? Surely you don't just throw it away.
No, well, fortunately, with the £250, which I won in the competition, we have been able to put a new pond in. So all our surplus plants can go in here now. I would like another water lily to go in here, but a smaller variety, obviously because of it being a smaller pond.
Well, what about Nymphea odorata alba, a white water lily which only spreads up to 3 feet? Grown in a pot in shallow water at the garden centre, I had to move it into a water lily basket, topped off with gravel, and lowered in stages, the first stage being so that the leaves will float at the surface. It's wrong to put these plants straight into deep water. Once they've established themselves, of course, they can stay at about 2 feet deep indefinitely. Jill already has water hawthorn, another plant with floating leaves, and we're aiming to cover about 2/3 of the surface, which shades the water, keeping it cooler, which discourages algae. Floating plants like a zola, a water fern, are good, and also a strange tropical plant, Eichhornia chrysipes, the water hyacinth. This floats by means of its inflated petioles, or leaf stalks, the disadvantage being that it won't last through the winter outside as it's tender. Water soldier, a native plant, is rather clever because it sinks to the bottom of the pond in winter, avoiding the worst of the cold, and rises up to the surface in the summer to catch the light. Jill already has Elodia crispa, the less invasive relative of Canadian pondweed. This is the Canadian pondweed, and these will act as oxygenators. Fix the stone to the base of the plant and it will just sink to the bottom. I suggest adding Myriophyllum, the parrot's feather, which needs to be rooted into the sides of the pond, and some of its growth will be above and some below the water. But of course, when you're planting into the sides of the pond, you can't use a trowel or a spade for fear of damaging the liner. You really need to use your hands to plant with. And moving on to other marginal plants, which of course can tolerate fluctuations in depth as they would in the wild, there's the attractive bog bean, Menianthes trifoliata. And also one of my favourites from North America, Pontideria cordata, with its spikes of mauve flowers. That's called the pickerel weed. In the bog garden itself, what about cotton grass, which likes to grow in shallow water? And also a miniature bulrush. I wouldn't recommend the large one because it would take over both ponds, I think, but Tiffa minima only grows to about 18 inches high. Attractive for its reddish foliage as well as bright crimson flowers is Lobelia cardinalis, which will grow to a nice clump of about 2 feet. Jill's wonderful ponds have inspired me to make a wildlife pond in my garden, but I'm afraid I've got her original problem now because my daughter's only 6 months old and I really don't think that small children and ponds are a good combination.
In a very small garden, of course, you won't have room for an elaborate water feature. This little retirement garden is just 8 yards by 6 yards, but I still want to put a pool in, mainly to attract wildlife. Well, you can make one with nothing more than a cut-off beer barrel like this. You can buy these in the garden centre, but do bear in mind that when you buy it, it will have dried out and so shrunk and will not be watertight. So the first job is to keep filling it up with water until the wood swells up and it becomes watertight. If you can totally immerse it, so much the better. Now, the secret of keeping the water clear in a very small pool is to keep it cool. So choose a semi-shaded site, and it's essential to sink the barrel into the ground. So the first job is to struggle it into the hole. And then it's important to get it absolutely level because you can't get a slope on water. And that's a little bit high. Side, that's better. Now notice that I've left this a little bit above the paving so that dirt doesn't kick into the pool. And the next job now is to put a little layer of garden soil into the bottom. The heavier the soil, the better, and then to fill up with water. Well, that looks really horrible, doesn't it? But don't worry, because within 2 or 3 days, all that gunge will have sunk to the bottom and the water will be crystal clear. And in order to keep it that way, you need a little bit of oxygenating weed. You can buy this at the water garden centre, and that just goes in the bottom and is pushed into the soil just as easily as that. Now, the other vital thing is to ensure that wildlife doesn't get trapped in the pond. If anything actually falls in the water, it will find it quite difficult to get out of a straight-sided container. Even frogs do. So the thing to do is to plant up a marginal plant into a big pot and sink that into the pool at the side. And that should finish up just below water level. And then you can just put a few pebbles in the top of the pot and make a convenient little step for wildlife to get out. The planting round this pool is not exactly like a bog garden, but if you work in plenty of organic matter, you can grow plants that like moist semi-shade, like hostas, irises, primulas and heuchera. Well, that looks rather nice. I'm now ready to welcome in my first dragonfly. I look forward to it. If you want to know more about how to make pools, there are a couple of in-depth articles in the July issue of the Gardener's World magazine. Well, next week, Pippa visits a vicar in Oldham with a really knotty problem. A Japanese knotweed problem, actually, which he thinks he's probably immortal. And we'll be continuing gardening under glass with advice on biological control and how to take care of your fuchsias. I'll be visiting a delightful cottage garden in North Devon with a small nursery attached, and it was their exhibit at the Chelsea Flower Show that really caught my eye. And I'll be back here at Barnsdale reminding you of your jobs for the week. Goodbye.